Well, good evening, church. This morning, I talked about what the death and resurrection of Jesus is supposed to look like in the life of a believer, but understanding that what I'm supposed to look like as a follower of Jesus and what I actually look like may be quite different. So what do I do if my life doesn't look like a new life in Christ? That's the question I want to answer tonight. I pray it will be beneficial. Our text tonight will be Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. And I'll read that now. It's Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. Therefore, if you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. I encourage you to read all of this chapter. This is a wonderful chapter that describes especially the first 17 verses. Verses 1 through 17 of Colossians chapter 3 is a very good description. Paul gives some very practical examples after this. He goes first and gives negative examples of sin that people need to leave behind. And then in those last verses, he gives, I think verses around 10 through 17, he gives lots of examples of what characteristics of a person who lives the resurrection life looks like. Wonderful chapter, but for time's sake, we'll just deal with the first 4 verses. Verse 1, where we'll begin. We'll just go through these 4. Therefore, if you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Now check that out. If you have been raised up with Christ. Now, a better rendering of it would not be if, it would be since, because he's talking to Christians, and he's saying it's not so much of an if statement as it is translated. It's more of a since. Since you have been raised up with Christ. Well, what does it mean? Since you have, or if you have been raised up with Christ. Well, it's referring to the resurrection that we talked about this morning. What Paul means is, if you've died to sin and been resurrected to a new life with Christ, then what? What does he say then? He says, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. What does it mean, though, to seek things above? Paul gives a little bit of a hint to us in verse 2. He says this, set your mind on the things above. So he's repeating again, set your mind on the things above. Then he goes on, not on the things that are on earth. In Romans 12:12, Paul says the same thing in a little bit different way when he says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So Paul kind of defines not being conformed to this world, or not looking like everyone else in the rest of the world and going along with the flow of things. Paul defines that as a person who has been transformed by the renewing of their mind. In other words, just like we talked about this morning, that's a picture of a person who has died their current life and been resurrected into a new life, no longer resembling the world, but now beginning to, step by step, slowly resembling the person of Jesus in their own life. Excuse me. If your life looks just like the lives of everyone else in this world who don't know Jesus, it's because you're not setting your mind on things above. It's because you've been focused on the same things that everyone else in the world is focused on. If your life looks like the rest of the people in this world, it's because you have conformed to this world. And when I hear that word conformed, I always think of a mold, just being poured into a mold, being stamped, and coming out looking exactly like everything else. It's what a mold's supposed to do. Every single production made within that mold looks identical. And Paul's saying, don't fit the mold of this world. Don't be conformed to that image. Be conformed to the image of Christ instead. Okay, so let's get a little bit of practicality on this. How do I live that way, Wes? How do I do that? I want to give you 3 practical things, okay? Number 1, to not be conformed to this world, spend time daily thinking about Jesus, his teachings, and what he did for you. You'll find this easier when you spend time in your Bible. It'll be easier for you because most of us don't know the teachings of Jesus well enough to just sit and dwell on those teachings without cracking open our Bible and reading them ourselves. But that's a good way to get your mind focused on things that are not of this world. It's a good way to start being focused, as Paul said, on things above where Jesus sits in heaven. His teaching. This world's not going to last, but his teachings, they're going to abide forever. So his teachings are those things that are above. So start with number 1. If you look like an image of this world, step number 1 to getting that turned around, start thinking about those heavenly things. Start thinking about Jesus daily and really get into his teachings. Number 2, stop thinking about yourself. This is kind of a combo one. Stop thinking about yourself and stop sinning. Most people, from the moment that they wake up in the morning until the moment that they go to bed at night, think only of themselves. I don't think that it's necessarily a thing that people deliberately do or try to do. I just think that's the state that, or that's what just comes most natural to all of us, looking out for ourselves, thinking about myself, thinking about what my needs are and fulfilling those needs. What I would encourage you to do is to stop doing that. I'm not saying stop taking care of yourself, but you're going to still take care of yourself. I'm saying stop thinking about yourself all the time. Stop thinking about yourself too much. Instead, when you wake in the morning, go to prayer to Jesus and pray something along the lines of, Jesus, show me opportunities today that I can bless other people. Who can I bless today? Who can you put into my path that I'll bless? And then start thinking. Don't just wait for don't wait for the Lord to bring someone to your doorstep. Be deliberate. Think about who can I bless today. Ask God to show that to you. A lot of us don't have to think too hard for very long before we'll be able to come up with some people that we know that we can bless. But look for those opportunities. God will reveal them to you as well. Now, when I said the other part of that, stop thinking about yourself, the stop sinning part, if you don't guard your heart and if you don't guard your mind, you will become transfixed on a daily basis on your sin. And this is even against your will. It's like even the Apostle Paul, though he didn't want to be preoccupied with his sin, but he said, the things I don't want to do, those are the things that I end up doing. He was a man who waged war with his sin. And church, that's what we have to do too. So many times, though, we don't wage war with our sin. We invite our sin in and put our arm around it on the couch. We invite our sin. We coddle our sin. We look at our sin. We indulge ourselves in our sin. If you do that, then you're going to conform to the world. That's what the world does. The world thinks only of itself. The world lives for and indulges in its sin. Church, we are called to so much higher of a standard than that. We're called to be so much different than that. Going back to the first part as well, when I said, don't think about yourself. The greatest commandment, which says in Deuteronomy, and Jesus repeats it in the New Testament, the greatest commandment is to love God. Love Him with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second greatest command is to love other people. Love your neighbor as yourself. So it's not just something that I'm trying to come up with as a practical way to get you to live your life where you're not conformed to this world. It is practical, but it's not something that I came up with. When you go to prayer in the morning and ask Jesus, who can I bless today? Show me who to bless, or put in my mind the person, and then you start pursuing that. You're actually fulfilling the second greatest command. You are loving your neighbor as yourself. You're putting your neighbor ahead of yourself, thinking of them before yourself. People, this is living out the resurrection life. This is what it looks like. And number 3, the third thing I would give you, the third practical way that I would give you to not be conformed to this world, but to live the resurrection life, is to live with eternity in mind. We are only here on this earth for a very limited time, and then comes all of eternity. This life is short. Eternity is forever. So don't allow yourself to be caught up in and consumed with this life. Now, I know that is easier said than done. Life comes at you from every direction. We fill our lives with so many things that before we know it, we're drowning and we're consumed. But we are challenged, church, to not do that. As Christians especially, to not be consumed with the world and lose Christ and the life that He's called us to live in the process. I saw the other day, I saw a very sad interview, and it was an old interview, but it was a sad interview, and it was of a man who had spent his entire life, his entire professional life, studying anteaters. And in the interview, the guy basically says that he wasted his life. He was sad. He was extremely sad because he felt that after studying anteaters his whole life, that he'd wasted his life. Those were years that he couldn't get back. That was time he couldn't get back. That was effort that he couldn't get back. He wrote a book, but he wasn't happy about it. He was very depressed. He was very sad at the end of his professional life. And he even said in the interview, I wasted my life studying anteaters. I should have done something else. Church, I don't want for you and I don't want for me to, at the end of my life, to look back on the things that I did and said, man, I really wish that I would have done something different. And especially I don't want to say I really wish I would have stepped out in faith and lived for the Lord. I wish that I would have done more of the good things that God prepared for me to do, instead of doing what I wanted to do, instead of indulging in my sin, and instead of just allowing my life to be cluttered with so many things that I didn't have time to serve and follow my Lord. Live, church, with a heavenly retirement in mind. Don't get caught up in the retirement dream that's sold in America, where you work hard for however many years of your life, and then you spend the next 20 to 30 years of your life indulging in pleasure. The Bible does not paint a picture of retirement like that. Actually, the Bible paints a picture of retirement as death, as you retire when you die. You retire when you go to heaven. That's when God has your retirement suite set up for you there. Pleasures beyond anything you can imagine. Don't try to create that heaven in retirement here on earth. No, I'm not saying if you've retired from a job, that I'm not saying work all of your life. What I'm saying is, don't retire from living for the Lord. Don't retire from righteousness. Don't retire from good works that God has called you to do. I just don't want you or me to look back at the end of our life and say, I wish I would have done more. And church, that's a sad thing, but I was witness to a man who on his deathbed was crying and was almost hysterical, saying, I've lived my life. I've lived all my life in the church, and I've never read the Bible, and I mean, and he was hysterical, and it was a sad thing. And I remember thinking to myself, man, I mean, I thought, I felt bad for him. I wish that he would have made better choices, but I also thought, I don't want to be in that place. I don't want to be like that at the end of my life. I want to be able to say, like the Apostle Paul said at the end of his life in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all those who have loved his appearing. What did Paul do? He lived out his resurrected life. He sought God's will and lived it out the very best that he could. But he couldn't live it out as well as he wanted to. He lived it out as best he could, but not as well as he wanted to live it out. And he even asked God at one point in his life to make it easier for him. And you know what God told him? 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 9. Basically, he said no. But here's what he said. He said a nicer version of no. He said, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. I especially want to encourage you with those words to Paul from the Lord, because there's going to be times that you feel like you're not good enough for service to God. When you ask God to take away your weakness, and he doesn't. Know this, remember his words to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, Wes, or fill in your name, for my power, his power is what he's referring to, is perfected in weakness. He knows your pursuit of him and your service to him will be flawed. He knows that. He chose to use you anyway. He knows you're going to try your best, but you're still going to sin. He knew that. But his grace, in the midst of all that, his grace is sufficient for you. That's wonderful news. Let's take a look at the last verses in our text, verses 3 and 4. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. What does it mean that your life is hidden with Christ? It means that people in this world cannot fully see or understand he who lives inside of you. To the world, your death to sin is a mystery, and your following of Jesus is an even greater mystery. And Paul even says it's foolishness to the world. But Paul says that someday Jesus will be revealed to all. And when that happens, what is hidden will be brought to light, and it will be revealed that you are a part of Christ. That's the part of you that is hidden that will be revealed. So let's go forth, church, and live out our resurrection lives. Let's show the world who we belong to in word and deed, never for our glory, but all for the glory of God. Until next time, love God and love others. I'm Wes LaFleur, signing off.